Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, July 28th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today: Ukraine extends martial law and pushes back elections. So Ukraine's parliament on Thursday voted to extend martial law and general mobilization, a move that pushes back parliamentary elections that were scheduled for October. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has previously said that elections cannot happen under martial law because it's prohibited under Ukraine's constitution. He told the Washington Post back in May, quote, "If we have martial law, we cannot have elections. The Constitution prohibits any elections during martial law. If there is no martial law, then there will be," end quote. So martial law has been extended several times since it was declared by Zelensky on February 24th, 2022, which is the day that Russia invaded. And it's expected to be extended as long as the war continues. And Ukraine's next presidential election is scheduled for March 2024. And that will also be pushed back if the war is still raging. And I'm pretty pessimistic these days, so I expect that this war will still be going on by then. So the vote on Thursday extended martial law and general mobilization for another 90 days from when it was set to expire on August 18th to November 15th. Ukraine, this martial law bans men ages 18 to 60 from leaving the country so they can be conscripted for war and thrown, into the front lines, thrown into battle. There's stories, I remember a Wall Street Journal report about kind of older men, in their 50s getting conscripted and not even being trained and being thrown into Bakhmut, being thrown into the meat grinder. So that's what this law allows the Zelensky government to do. And in March 2022, Zelensky used these powers to ban 11 opposition parties, over allegations of Russia ties, Russian influence, and he also nationalized the television media. And the Ukrainian government has also seized control of several companies using wartime authorities. So that's what they've done with these powers. And, this war, supporting this war, is being sold to the American public, as a fight for democracy and freedom and all that. And, this definitely goes against that narrative. And that's how Zelensky and these Ukrainian officials have been trying to sell it also to the West to support them. So Ukraine's constitution does not allow elections under martial law, but, I think they would be able to suspend it. And if they really wanted to have elections, if they really cared about democracy, so you would think an election is important when this government is, fighting a war, conscripting people to throw into the front lines. And from what I understand, Zelensky's polling pretty well anyway. But there's precedent for it as well. The one precedent that most people mention is during the Civil War. They still had elections, even though, the Confederacy controlled a lot of states at the time. And someone pointed out in comments when I last covered this that the U.S. during the Vietnam War, the U.S. had South Vietnam have elections, which that's probably not the best example because I think they were notoriously fraudulent, and the U.S. also backed coups in South Vietnam. But still, at least, they had the guise of democracy going on there. They just voted on that on Thursday. So, again, this extends it to November 15th, and we should expect them to extend it again for another 90 days. That's what they've been doing throughout the war. All right, the next one here. Putin says that fighting in southeastern Ukraine intensified significantly. Russian President Vladimir Putin said Thursday that fighting in southeastern Ukraine intensified significantly a day after U.S. officials said that the main thrust of the Ukrainian counteroffensive has started. Putin said, quote, "As of the recent days, yes, indeed, we confirm that the hostilities have intensified and significantly too. The main clashes occurred on what they call the main strike direction in the west, the Zaporozhye direction," end quote. So Putin said that the Ukrainian assault has yielded no success and claimed Ukrainian forces suffered heavy losses. He said, quote, "The enemy achieved no success on any contact swath. All counteroffensive attempts were stopped, and the enemy was pushed back with high casualties," end quote. So for their part, Ukrainian officials claim that their forces captured a village in the Donetsk Oblast, one that is near the border with Zaporozhye. And Ukraine has made some incremental gains in its counteroffensive, taking, small villages, but there have been no major breakthroughs. So U.S. officials told the New York Times on Wednesday that Ukraine had committed thousands of NATO-trained reserves for its new push. But on Thursday, a U.S. military official told the Times that it was not clear how many soldiers they will commit. The official said, quote, "It remains to be seen what they will truly commit, when they'll commit it, and where," end quote. So the goal of Ukraine's new push here is to sever, what they call this land bridge from Crimea to Russia. And there is, quite a bit of territory that they would have to push through to get there. And then the question is, wouldn't they just be surrounded by Russian forces once they push through? Would they be able to hold that territory? I'm not sure. And, right now you have Putin saying and Russian officials saying that they're, repelling these big attacks, and I haven't seen any change, on the battle lines. So again, it's I guess early in this kind of renewed counteroffensive, but I don't think we should expect much Ukrainian success based on everything I've been covering lately. All these, the narrative that Ukraine has a chance at doing well in this counteroffensive is pretty much gone in the West. There's been all these reports about the U.S. and other Western officials saying that Ukraine doesn't really have a chance, saying that they knew Ukraine didn't have a chance before this thing, which we also knew from the Discord leaks. So, I think there's going to be a new round of heavy fighting, but I don't know if it's really going to change much. All right, the next one here, the U.S. has not sent arms control proposals to Russia. So arms control experts have criticized the Biden administration for failing to send a proposal to Russia on maintaining limits on nuclear weapons deployments that was publicly floated by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan last month. So Sullivan said on June 2nd that the U.S. was willing to open talks with Russia on a framework to preserve curbs on nuclear arms deployments after 2026, which is the final year of the New START treaty, and that's the last nuclear arms control treaty between the two powers. So while Russia has suspended its participation in New START, both sides have said they will continue complying with the treaty's limits, and New START caps the deployment of nuclear warheads for both sides at 1,550, and it also restricts the deployment of nuclear bombers, submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Sullivan said that the U.S. was open to talks on the issue without preconditions, but last week, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said that Russia had not received any proposal from the U.S. on resuming arms control talks. He added that Moscow has studied what Sullivan said publicly and said Russia was not interested in negotiations until the U.S. changes its hostile policies against Russia, referring to the proxy war in Ukraine. Ryabkov said, quote, "I would like to say that we are not ready to and will not conduct this dialogue based on what the Americans are now proposing, as they ignore several key points in this entire configuration. We must first and foremost make sure that the U.S. policy, which is fundamentally hostile toward Russia, is changing for the better. That is far from happening now, and I would rather say the opposite is going on," end quote. So Daryl Kimball, who's the executive director of the Arms Control Association, he told Reuters that he believes Ryabkov's statement still leaves open the possibility for eventual negotiations. He said that his interpretation is that there is still room for the U.S. to communicate about what they're interested in if they were actually communicating with Russia. So he said that there's no excuse that the administration has delayed for nearly 2 months the formal communication of this proposal to the Kremlin. He said that such negotiations would be difficult in good times and extraordinarily difficult so as long as Russia's war on Ukraine continues. So I've been kind of thinking maybe there's some backdoor arms control talks going on. It's good that they're both still complying with the limits of the New START, but it doesn't seem like there's any sort of negotiations happening based on this, which is just a bad sign. All right, the next one here, this is from Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute. Biden to share evidence of alleged Russian war crimes with the ICC. So President Joe Biden has ordered his administration to begin sharing evidence of alleged Russian war crimes committed in Ukraine with the International Criminal Court, the ICC, based in The Hague, a U.S. official said on Wednesday. So the White House began notifying lawmakers of this change in policy on Tuesday. So in contrast to the National Security Council and the State Department, the Pentagon had long opposed cooperation with the ICC. After the ICC issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin in March, the Pentagon blocked Washington from sharing information with the court. The military intervened over concerns that doing so might set a precedent, allowing U.S. troops to be prosecuted for similar actions. Lawmakers in both parties sharply criticized the DoD for making this decision. So during the Trump administration, Connor just goes over some of the actions that the U.S. has taken against the ICC. The U.S. sanctioned ICC officials during the Trump administration for attempting to investigate American war crimes in Afghanistan. Biden lifted those sanctions but denounced the court for investigating both U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan and the Israeli apartheid regime's crimes against Palestinians, including large-scale massacres in the Gaza Strip. So reports suggest that the reason for the about-face is that Biden has taken a side in the debate, siding with those who favor working with the ICC. Oh, and also they lifted the sanctions, but I believe the ICC dropped the Afghanistan investigation. So, the pressure worked. And now the U.S. is trying to use this court, where to its advantage. And of course, in the future, if the ICC ever tries to go after the U.S. again, they're probably going to pressure them in some way. So yeah, he is, looks like they're sharing it now. But again, it does open the U.S. up for similar scrutiny. So, I'm not sure exactly how the ICC works. The officials in there, if they are kind of on the U.S. side. But, I wouldn't be surprised if in the future they might open, there's plenty of U.S. war crimes to investigate. So I wouldn't be surprised if they try to look into them in the future, or, Saudi war crimes in Yemen that the U.S. has enabled. We'll see how the U.S. responds then. All right, the next one here. Republicans urge Harris to meet with Taiwan's vice president. So 6 House Republicans have sent a letter to Vice President Kamala Harris urging her to meet with Taiwanese Vice President Lai Ching-te when he stops in the U.S. next month on his way to and from Paraguay, which is one of the few countries that has diplomatic relations with Taipei. So Lai is scheduled to visit Paraguay on August 15th. According to Taipei Times, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that Lai is expected to transit the United States on both the incoming and outgoing legs of his trip. Neither the U.S. nor Taiwan have said if Lai will meet with any U.S. officials while he's in the United States. So, as we know, Beijing is opposed to meetings between U.S. and Taiwanese government officials as it views them as a violation of Washington's One China policy. When Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen traveled through the U.S. in April, she met with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and this marked the highest level meeting between the U.S. and Taiwan that's taken place in the United States since 1979, when Washington formally severed diplomatic ties with Taipei. So the Tsai-McCarthy meeting provoked major Chinese military drills around Taiwan, as did Nancy Pelosi's trip there when she was the House Speaker. And, if Harris meets with Lai, it's almost certainly going to provoke more military drills. Maybe China will take things to another level. It's not clear. So the letter to Harris, which was shared by Representative Tom Tiffany, he's a Republican from Wisconsin, it said that Lai's visit gave her the opportunity to make use of the Taiwan Travel Act. And that became law in 2018 to encourage contacts between U.S. and Taiwanese officials. The Taiwan Travel Act says that it should be U.S. policy to allow officials at all levels of the U.S. government to travel to Taiwan to meet with their Taiwanese counterparts. It says that it should also allow high-level officials from Taiwan to enter the United States and to meet with officials of the United States. So the letter notes that Harris supported the Taiwan Travel Act when she was a senator. And the letter was also signed by Tiffany and 5 other Republican House members, Representatives Andy Ogles from Tennessee, Byron Donalds from Florida, Buddy Carter from Georgia, Scott Perry from Pennsylvania, and Scott Desjarlais from Tennessee. So all Republicans. And China has already warned against Lai visiting the United States and said that it's a priority to stop the trip. And from China's perspective, this visit might be more sensitive than normal because Lai is running for president right now as the ruling Democratic Progressive Party's nominee. Elections are scheduled for January 2024, and Lai has been leading the polls. So a lot of people expected the Kuomintang to be able to win in these presidential elections, which is the main opposition party. But now there's this new party, the Taiwan People's Party, the TPP, and they've been coming in second in the polls. And the DPP has been leading. So, it looks like the DPP has a chance of holding on. Unless the Kuomintang and the TPP decide to run together, then I think they would probably beat the DPP just based on these polls. And, I don't know much about Taiwanese politics. That's just me checking the polls out once in a while. Because, if the DPP wins, that means none of this is going to change. The U.S. increasing military diplomatic ties with Taiwan, which is eventually just going to probably lead to war in the region. So, if the Kuomintang wins, I think there might be a big change, but it doesn't look like they are. All right. So the next one here, Austin meets Papua New Guinea leaders to boost military ties. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin met with leaders in Papua New Guinea on Thursday to discuss expanding military ties after the two countries signed a defense cooperation agreement that will give the U.S. access to bases in the Pacific Island nation. The two nations also signed a maritime surveillance agreement allowing the U.S. Coast Guard to patrol Papua New Guinea's exclusive economic zone, which extends 200 nautical miles from its coast. Austin announced that a U.S. Coast Guard cutter would be arriving in August. Papua New Guinea is pretty far from the American coast. It's just north of Australia, but the U.S. Coast Guard is really expanding its presence in this part of the world. So Papua New Guinea Prime Minister James Marape has faced some domestic backlash for inking this Defense Cooperation Agreement, DCA, with the U.S., and it has yet to be ratified by the country's parliament. So at a press conference with Austin, Marape insisted that the deal was not about the U.S. preparing for a future war with China, which was interesting to see what he had to say. He said, quote, "I want to give assurances to everyone here, including our friends from Asia, that this is not about setting up for war. Rather, it's about setting up our presence for nation building in Papua New Guinea and this part of planet Earth and Indo-Pacific," end quote. He also noted that the U.S. military has bases much closer to China and Taiwan. He said, quote, "They have bases in the Philippines, in Korea, elsewhere, much closer to China than PNG. My audience here in PNG are quite hypersensitive to these sort of questions, and they may misconstrue that Secretary Austin and the U.S. Defense is building up an offensive base," end quote. So despite his assurances, U.S. military officials have made clear that they are, in fact, preparing for war with China by expanding in the Pacific. This is all part of their plan. General Kenneth Wilsbach, who's the commander of U.S. Pacific Air Forces, recently told Nikkei Asia that the purpose of expanding in the region was to give China more areas that it would need to target in a potential conflict. He said, quote, "Obviously, we would like to disperse in as many places as we can to make the targeting problem for the Chinese as difficult as possible. A lot of those runways where we would operate from are in the Pacific Island nations," end quote. So the U.S. deal with Papua New Guinea is seen as a response to China signing a security agreement with the Solomon Islands, which is very close to Papua New Guinea. So when the Solomon Islands signed that deal with China, there was a huge backlash from the U.S. and Australia, more so Australia. They really freaked out about it. So much so that the Solomon Islands prime minister said he felt like he was being threatened with an invasion. So it's interesting. It kind of shows you the difference in styles when it comes to dealing with other countries. Papua New Guinea, Marape is saying that China didn't care about them signing this deal with the U.S. He said, quote, "When we were signing the DCA with USA, Chinese government through the embassy here did relay to us that they have no issue whatsoever with us signing the DCA with the USA," end quote. So just a different strategy than what the U.S. and its, Western partners do, which is, sanction and threaten and harass. That's what they did to Cambodia. That's what the U.S. did to Cambodia when they were moving close to China, and it just resulted in, them moving even closer to China. It's not the best strategy to try to sanction your way out of everything. All right. So the next one here, Niger. U.S. forces are assessing the situation after a coup. So U.S. forces in Niger are restricting their movement and assessing the situation following a military coup that overthrew President Mohamed Bazoum. And this is what two Pentagon officials told NBC on Thursday. So a group of Nigerian soldiers appeared on TV on Wednesday saying that they ousted Bazoum, who was democratically elected in 2021. A spokesman for this group of soldiers, who call themselves the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, said, quote, "The defense and security forces have decided to put an end to the regime that you are familiar with," end quote. So the following day, Niger's military released a statement saying that it supported the coup. The chief of staff of Niger's armed forces said, quote, "The military command of the Nigerian Armed Forces has decided to subscribe to the declaration by the Defense and Security Forces in order to avoid a deadly confrontation between the various forces," end quote. So the U.S. condemned the military takeover and is backing Bazoum, but has stopped short of formally calling it a coup. The reason why they're not doing that is because that would mean they would have to cut off aid to the country. Secretary of State Antony Blinken did warn that the U.S. partnership with the country depends on democratic governance and respect for the rule of law. So the U.S. has a significant military presence in Niger with at least 1,016 troops in the country. That's according to a notice the White House gave to Congress recently about its presence, overseas military presences. So that's a decent amount, a little over 1,000. That's more than are in Syria, as far as we know, and Iraq. Iraq, there's 2,500. More so than Somalia. So the U.S. also constructed a major drone base in Niger known as Air Base 201, which houses MQ-9 Reaper drones, and it supports U.S. counterterrorism operations across Africa. So the U.S. counterterrorism mission in Africa has been a complete and utter failure. So Nick Turse, who's kind of the guy on Africa and AFRICOM, who is a really good journalist covering that part of the world that's often neglected by people, including myself. My knowledge of Africa and these countries, especially in West Africa, is super limited. But Turse explained in an article that he wrote about the coup that in 2002 and 2003, which was the first years of U.S. counterterrorism assistance to Niger, the State Department counted just 9 terrorist attacks in all of Africa. He wrote, quote, "Last year, the number of violent events in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Western Niger alone reached 2,736, according to a report by the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, which is a Defense Department research institution. This represents a jump of more than 30,000% since the U.S. began its counterterrorism efforts," end quote. So Turse noted that at least 10 coups launched in West Africa since 2008 were led by U.S.-trained soldiers, and including a few in Burkina Faso, Mali, Gambia, Guinea. So a lot of coups that these U.S.-trained soldiers are involved in. That doesn't mean that the U.S. is ordering these coups, but it says a lot about how the U.S. influence and training, what it has done to the region. He said that it was not immediately clear. Turse said that it was not immediately clear if the soldiers who took power in Niger have received U.S. training. I think there's a good chance that at least some of them did, at one point or another. But yeah, it just shows the failure of, the terror wars in those numbers and just the situation in these countries. All right, the last story here in the news section is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Representative Jim Jordan shows proof that the White House pushed Facebook to censor Americans. So I haven't had the chance to really look through all of this, but Jim Jordan, House Representative, posted what he called the Facebook files on Twitter, and he published internal Facebook discussions exposing how the company bent to pressure from the White House and censored Americans. In the documents, the Joe Biden administration is shown pressuring Facebook to censor a popular television news host and remove a meme. And this seems to be mostly COVID related. This was in April 2021. And, this one example that he showed was the White House demanding that Facebook remove a meme that said, 10 years from now, you will be watching TV and hear, did you lose a loved one to the COVID vaccine? You may be entitled to, you get the idea. So anyway, it was that meme, and they asked Facebook to remove it, and I think they did. So, that's the situation with them pushing the censorship. So go check that out. Again, I didn't really read through the whole thing, so I got to follow up on that. But that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Ted Galen Carpenter. Reluctant Warriors. U.S. allies should restrain Washington on Taiwan. One from Judge Knapp. Has liberty died in our hearts? One from Ramsey Baroud. PA President Abbas, a puppet in the hands of Israel and the U.S. And one from James Bovard, remembering the atrocities of the Korean War, not the propaganda, which I think is a very important article about a war that often gets overlooked. And just he talks about how wasteful it was, how 40,000 American soldiers died pointlessly. And again, it's just something that doesn't get much attention. This was published Thursday, July 27th, which was the 70th anniversary of the armistice that ended the fighting between the North and the South. And I wasn't even aware of that. That just goes to show how little people, care about the Korean War or even paying attention to the situation today. The war is technically not over, and that's why the U.S. is flying bombers and sending nukes to South Korea. It's just completely ridiculous. It's just a holdover of this war, that the United States didn't need to be involved in the first place. That's it. We have one more. The spotlight is from James Banford, U.S. and Russia's standoff over prisoner exchange. And he's usually writing at The Nation. Yep, that is over at The Nation. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Tell your friends about this show. Comment and like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you watch, Odyssey, Rumble. I appreciate all the feedback and the support. And this show is always growing, so it's pretty cool. And, I'm just very happy with the way it's been going. But I'll be back after the weekend. I hope everybody has a good one. I'll talk to you soon.